Let's walk the talk.
This is Clement Manyathela
on 702.
24 minutes before 11 o'clock. We started a new series 3 weeks ago looking at South African wars, the wars that took place in this country, and getting a bit of a history lesson about what transpired. So we started by looking at the First Boer War. Last week we discussed the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, and today we're discussing the Second Anglo-Boer War. In fact, this year marks over a century since the end of one of the most defining conflicts in South African history. This Second Anglo-Boer War fought between 1899 and 1902. It was a war that really reshaped the political, economic, and social fabric of the region, setting the stage for the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910 and influencing the racial and cultural divisions that would then define the country for decades. André Wessels is a senior professor and research fellow at the Department of History at the University of the Free State, who's going to guide us through this conversation. If you've got some questions, some inputs to make, you can call us on 011-883-0702. Alternatively, you can send your WhatsApp messages or voice notes on 072-702-1702. Professor André Wessels, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I sincerely appreciate it.
Let's start in the beginning. What led to this Second Anglo-Boer War?
Yes, well, the reasons or the causes of the war are very, very complex. Those people who are interested, those listeners who are interested, there are several books that have been written in this regard. But one could summarize it by saying that the Anglo-Boer War was the culmination of many decades, perhaps even a century or more, of tension between, on the one hand, Afrikaner nationalism, and on the other hand, British imperialism. And what, of course, sparked the war was also the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand in 1886, and the expansion of the British Empire in the course of the 19th century. As we know, Cecil John Rhodes, for example, had this vision of Cape to Cairo under British control. And two small Boer republics, especially the Transvaal with its gold deposits, stood in the way of that dream of Cecil John Rhodes and other British imperialists.
Mm-hmm. And was this just a clash of the armies, or are we talking here ideologies, identities, imperial ambitions as well?
I think you are correct if you say that it was much more than just a clash between armies. It was indeed, in German we have the word Weltanschauung, the way in which you view the world. And here we had a clash between, on the one hand, those freedom-loving Afrikaans-speaking people. I use Afrikaans now in a very general sense of the word because at that stage the Afrikaans language was still developing. On the one hand, and then British imperialists who believed that to be a really civilized nation, a really civilized people, you had to be under British imperialism, under the umbrella of British imperialism. So it was much more than just a clash between armies. It was indeed, as you indicate, a clash between Weltanschauung, between ideologies, between different cultures also.
Mm-hmm. My understanding from what I've read in the past about this war is that there was a point where even the British adopted a policy where they started destroying farms, they were burning crops, and they were placing civilians in concentration camps to cut off support for the Boer fighters. Tell us more about that, because these camps became quite infamous for their appalling conditions.
Absolutely. The Anglo-Boer War can be divided into 4 phases. The first 3 phases, one can say, were semi-conventional phases. They were never completely conventional because the Boers didn't have a standing army. They had a commando system, so all the citizens, all the white male citizens, were in times of war called up to fight against the enemy. So during the first three phases, the first phase, the Boers invaded the British territory, the Cape Colony and Natal on a small scale. During the second phase was the first British offensive, when they then tried to defeat the Boers who had taken up positions inside the Cape Colony and Natal. They were then the British forces were defeated during the so-called Black Week at Colenso, at Magersfontein, and also in the Cape Colony. But then the British Commander-in-Chief Buller was replaced by Lord Roberts. He launched a second offensive, and he was then able to defeat the Boers on the Western Front. General Piet Cronje surrendered at Paardeberg. The British under Buller was still able to break through in Natal and relieve the siege of Ladysmith. And the Boers then realized that they were now on the back foot because they were physically and psychologically dislodged by the British offensive. And at the Krijgsraad, at the Council of War meeting that took place at Kroonstad on the 17th of March 1900, they then decided to resort to guerrilla warfare. In other words, they broke up their armies in inverted commas, into smaller commando units, and they then focused on the destruction of the British railway lines, of the infrastructure, hit-and-run tactics. Now, this caught the British off guard because the British army was a conventionally trained army, and it took them some time, even although the British were in control of the capital city of the Free State, Bloemfontein, which they captured on the 13th of March 1900. They captured Pretoria on the 5th of June 1900, and they took over many towns and villages. But in a certain sense, they were only in control as far as their guns could actually shoot. And this then led to a transformation of the British Army in South Africa, first under Lord Roberts, and later during the watch of his successor, Lord Kitchener, who became the Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in South Africa at the end of November 1900. Yeah. And Roberts and later Kitchener then worked out an elaborative counter-guerrilla strategy. And this counter-guerrilla strategy entailed, for example, the scorched earth policy, because every Boer farm was, in a sense, a source of food, fodder for horses, military intelligence, also hospital facilities, in the sense that wounded Boers could be taken to the farms where the women and the children who were left at the farm could look after the wounded. So from a purely military point of view, these farms became legitimate military targets. So what the British did, they burned down the houses. Approximately 30,000 Boer farmsteads were destroyed, but also the homes of the black farm laborers. So at least 60,000, but probably many more homes of black farm laborers were also destroyed. And now the question was what to do with these people who had lost their homes. And that then led to the development of a camp system. Now, traditionally, in most sources, you also refer to it concentration camps. I prefer to use the word internment camp because one has to make a clear distinction between the camps of the Anglo-Boer War and the concentration/extermination camps in Europe during the Second World War. In other words, the camp system that was built up by the Nazis in the run-up to and also during the Second World War.
Yeah, because that was completely different, right?
Yeah.
What role did black people play in the war, and how did it affect their communities? I hear what you say about when the farms were destroyed, some of the homes of black people were destroyed. But my understanding is that, they were not merely just bystanders in this war. Many served as laborers. There were drivers for both sides, and thousands were displaced. Can you just explain what role they played?
Yes. No, thank you for that question, because you are touching on a very, very important aspect of the Anglo-Boer War. Right from the start, both the British and the Boers said this is going to be a white man's war. But that was right from the start not the case. on the side of the Boers, at least 10,000 and probably 14,000 black people went on commando with the Boers, not as combatants, but as people who had to look after the horses, who had to do the washing, who had to look after food supplies and everything. And it was basically to serve the Boers on commando as, and I put the word servants between inverted commas. Right. But the British did exactly the same. They also recruited local black people, once again, to look after the horses as wagon drivers, who had to do general work in the British camps, etc. And eventually then, during the guerrilla phase of the war, more and more black people not only served in the British Army as laborers, but also as combatants. Because just as the Boers knew the terrain very well, most of them grew up on farms. Many black people also grew up on farms on the platteland, in the rural areas. So, and the British did not know the veld that well, so they incorporated black people into their mobile units being then their commandos, because they converted many of their infantry units into mounted infantry. In other words, infantry soldiers who now fought on horseback. And thousands and thousands of black people also became combatants. In the first place as blockhouse guards, because part of the elaborate British counter-guerrilla strategy was the erection of more than 9,000 blockhouses across the war zone. If you drive through South Africa today, and I sincerely hope that your listeners will also do this if they haven't done it in the past, there are still more than 100, perhaps even a little more, of these blockhouses standing across South Africa. Square masonry blockhouses, but also round rice-type blockhouses. So to man these blockhouses, the British had a problem with regard to not sufficient troops, although in total 4,400 and 48,735 white soldiers from Britain, but also from colonies like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada fought in South Africa. But they still had too few troops, and therefore they then used black people as blockhouse guards. They used them as spies. They used them for reconnaissance work. But during the guerrilla phase, you also had black commandos with white British officers who were in the field fighting the Boers. And my calculation is that probably as many as 140,000 black and also brown people served in a combatant capacity as part of the British Army during the Anglo-Boer War. Yeah. And they played an enormously important role in the eventual controversial British victory by the 31st of May 1902, when the Boers surrendered.
Yeah. Well, Prof, we're going to take a quick ad break, and when we come back, we'll continue this conversation. We'll look at what happened when the war ended, because we saw the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging on the 31st of May 1902, which then led to the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. So you'll take us through that after the break.
You're with Clement Manyathela.
7:02. Let's walk the talk.
It's 8 minutes before 11 o'clock. We're speaking to Professor André Wessels, who's a senior professor and research fellow at the Department of History at the University of the Free State. And we've been talking about the Second Anglo-Boer War, and Professor Wessels has taken us through what caused the whole war, what happened during the war. And Prof, I would like you to now take us through how that war ended, because we saw the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. What did that mean for this country?
Yeah. By April, May 1902, most of the Boer leaders realized that they would not be able to defeat the British in South Africa. And that then led to peace negotiations at Vereeniging and also in Pretoria. And it then culminated in the signing of the so-called Peace of Vereniging, although it was strictly speaking the surrender document 5 minutes past 11 on Saturday evening, the 31st of May 1902. Now, the war left all South Africans, if I use the term as we know South Africans today as a unitary state, all South Africans disillusioned. The Afrikaner, the Boers, were disillusioned because they had lost their independence. At least 31,000 white Afrikaans-speaking civilians died in the internment camps, 80% of them children 16 years and younger. So there was enormous trauma. But black people in South Africa were also traumatized by the war. At least 23,000, but probably many more black people also died in internment camps. Once again, most of them children 16 years and younger. The British authorities had promised black people political rights if they sided with the British against the Boers during the war. But at Vereniging, as part of the negotiations and efforts by the British to reconcile the British Empire with the Afrikaner, those promises were shoved to one side, and black people did not get the political rights that they were promised. And that obviously led to huge frustrations, and one can draw a line from Vereniging to the establishment of the African National Congress in 1912. On the other hand, one can also draw a line from Vereniging to the establishment of the National Party in 1914. So those two political parties, those two political organizations that to a large extent dominated the political course of events in South Africa in the course of the 20th century, their roots in more ways than one goes back to the Anglo-Boer War and to the aftermath of the war. So one cannot understand the history of 20th century South Africa if one does not have an understanding of the history of the Anglo-Boer War. And that is why I sincerely appreciate this conversation that we have today. We are at the moment commemorating the 125th anniversary of the Anglo-Boer War, and it will be absolutely wonderful if all South Africans will either once again or for the first time take stock of their history, which includes the history of the Anglo-Boer War. I mean, the guerrilla phase of the Anglo-Boer War was absolutely a brutal phase in the war, and it contributed towards a civil war element in the conflict, especially in the Cape Colony. It also played a role in causing the conflict, one could say, to generate into a regional total war. Total war is a concept of the 20th century. But the Anglo-Boer War was, in a sense, also a total war. And as I've already said, I mean, the rights of black and brown people were sacrificed in the interest of reconciliation between Boer and Britain. And by the end of the war, the British Army in South Africa they did indeed muddle through to a controversial victory, and Kitchener in particular was ruthlessly successful in implementing his counter-guerrilla strategy. And as I've indicated before the ad break, black and brown people played an enormously important role in that counter-guerrilla strategy. But the fact of the matter is that the guerrilla phase of the war left a trail of destruction, a trail of death, and a legacy of trauma and of bitterness, which to a large extent, you also alluded to it, indeed shaped the history of 20th century South Africa and beyond.
Do you have books that you can recommend for our listeners that are interested to learn more about this war? Prof, I've got someone who says they're currently reading Thomas Pechman's The Boer War, so they're asking if you can recommend some more authoritative material out there about this war.
Well, there are more than 2,700 books that have already been written on the Anglo-Boer War. So I mean, I don't want to misuse this opportunity with references to my own publications. But Bill Nasser, for example, wrote a book on Abraham Eso, a Black South African War in South Africa. There are many, many publications that have been written on various aspects of the war. If you want to look at general histories, you have mentioned Pakenham. There's also there are those who are really serious, who would like to do a lot of reading work. There are the books by Leo Amery, a seven volume series of books on the Anglo-Boer War. There's the official history that was written by Morris and Grant, four volumes. And Frans Johan Pretorius wrote on the Anglo-Boer War. So there are many
of them.
Thomas Pakenham's book is one of the best reads that you sort of a concise book on the war.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, and also do go check out Professor André Wessels' material as well. Thank you, Prof, for making time for us. He's a senior professor and research fellow at the University of the Free State.